The skies above the Middle East have long carried the echoes of rockets and the cries of mothers. For decades, the world's most powerful nations have promised peace, yet each attempt has collapsed into rubble and grief. Washington tried, Brussels tried. Even the United Nations deployed its finest negotiators. Still, the guns kept firing. But in May 2025, something happened that no one saw coming. A young African soldier, a 37-year-old leader from a land often dismissed as too small, too poor, too powerless, stepped forward and demanded the world listen. His name, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. While American presidents struggled, while European envoys failed, Traoré called both Benjamin Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas to the same table in Amman, Jordan. And against every prediction they came. Israel and Palestine, two sides locked in a century of war, agreed to a ceasefire that has lasted longer than any in over a decade. 4 months of silence where once there was blood. 4 months of aid trucks rolling instead of tanks. 4 months of mothers daring to hope. Ask yourself, how did this happen? How did a young African leader once mocked as naive by Western diplomats achieve what the White House and the Kremlin could not? And why now is the world suddenly calling him Africa's Mandela, a voice of moral authority who forces even Washington to reconsider its role in global peace? Brothers and sisters, this is not just about the Middle East. This is about the rise of Africa as a peacemaker, about a new generation of leaders proving that the wisdom born from suffering can heal what empires have broken. If you believe the world needs to hear this story, please share it. If you are one of the first to recognize Ibrahim Traoré as a leader of peace, let your voice be counted. And subscribe now, because the truth you are about to hear is bigger than the headlines, and it may change how you see the future of Africa, the Middle East, and the world. On May 15, 2025, the announcement came not from Washington, not from Brussels, not from the United Nations, but from Ouagadougou, the dusty capital of Burkina Faso. Standing before a crowd of citizens and cameras, President Ibrahim Traoré made a declaration that reverberated across continents. Africa will host Middle East peace negotiations. Africa, a continent that knows the pain of colonization and the weight of war, will show the world what true leadership looks like. The statement was bold, almost unbelievable. For decades, peace in the Middle East had been the playground of great powers. American presidents hosted Camp David summits. European envoys flew endlessly between Tel Aviv and Ramallah. Yet every handshake collapsed into new gunfire. And now here was a 37-year-old African soldier claiming that his nation, one of the poorest in the world, could succeed where the giants had failed. The reactions came swiftly. From Jerusalem, the Israeli Foreign Ministry dismissed Traoré's move as naive African posturing. They saw no reason to trust a leader whose own country was battling insurgents in the Sahel. From Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority responded differently, welcoming any initiative that promised real dialogue. In Washington, the State Department warned against unauthorized diplomatic interventions, making it clear that American influence in the region was not to be challenged. Brussels offered skepticism, questioning whether Africa had the resources or the stature to mediate such a conflict. But behind the headlines, intelligence reports began to reveal a deeper calculation. Traoré was not acting blindly. He understood that Africa carried a unique moral authority. It was the one continent least entangled in the centuries of Middle Eastern rivalries. His own credibility came not from lofty speeches, but from the battlefield. He had personally led Burkina Faso's fight against terrorist groups in the Sahel, and the world knew his reputation as a soldier who bled alongside his people. Moreover, Traoré had positioned Burkina Faso within a new global balance. Russia and China stood ready to provide diplomatic cover, while African nations themselves rallied to his side. Even economically, Africa's vast resources from uranium to gold meant that Traoré was not entering the arena empty-handed. His move was not a dream. It was a strategy. And so the impossible began to unfold. Within 2 weeks of back-channel talks, both the Israeli and Palestinian delegations agreed to attend preliminary discussions in Amman, Jordan. Analysts could hardly believe it. Here was proof that a voice outside the traditional Western framework could break through the walls of mistrust. The terms of these talks were simple but revolutionary. The African Union would serve as a neutral moderator, ensuring that neither side felt cornered by Western or Arab powers. There would be no preconditions, no arguments over borders, no debates over recognition, just an immediate focus on humanitarian needs. And international guarantees would come not from NATO or the European Union, but from Russia, China, and the African Union. This was the foundation of what became known as the Impossible Mission. Newspapers from Cairo to Paris carried the headline, "Africa enters the Middle East." Commentators debated whether this was the dawn of a new era or the folly of an inexperienced soldier. But on the streets of Gaza and Tel Aviv, where ordinary people had long grown weary of politics, there was a flicker of something that had not been felt in years: cautious hope. For Africa and for the world, the stage was set. The world's most intractable conflict and the least expected mediator. As May turned into June, all eyes shifted toward Amman, where Ibrahim Traoré prepared to attempt the impossible, turning Africa's scars into the seed of peace. The heat of Amman in early June 2025 carried a tension thicker than the desert air. In a heavily guarded conference hall, Israeli and Palestinian delegations sat across from each other, their eyes wary, their hands clenched. They had come only because of Traoré, and for 15 days, the world held its breath. From the start, the young African president refused the script of Western diplomacy. There were no staged photo opportunities, no endless arguments over territory lines. Instead, Traoré began with stories. He spoke not as a president, but as a soldier and a son of Africa. On the first day, he described the villages of Burkina Faso torn apart by terrorists. He told of mothers weeping over sons killed in ambushes, of fathers burying daughters who had dreamed only of school. His voice did not waver. This pain, he said, knows no nationality, no religion. The blood of a Palestinian child is the same red as the blood of an Israeli child, and both are the same red as the children of Burkina Faso. Those words cracked a wall that decades of negotiations could not touch. Palestinian delegate Saeb Erekat admitted later, "For the first time in years, someone spoke to our hearts, not our politics." On the other side, Israeli Representative Tzachi Hanegbi confessed that Traoré's authority came not from theory, but from lived experience. He understood our fears of terrorism, yet he respected Palestinian suffering. That is a balance no Western mediator has ever achieved. Days turned into nights of raw dialogue. For the first 3 days, delegations shared personal traumas uninterrupted. On days 4 through 7, they sat together in joint sessions, forced to listen without rebuttal. By the second week, the impossible was happening. Both sides began drafting practical measures: humanitarian corridors, prisoner exchanges, independent monitoring teams. Traoré's insistence was clear: before politics, there must be humanity. June 15, 2025, cameras captured what few dared to believe would occur. In that Amman conference hall, the Amman Accords were signed. It was not a grand final peace treaty, but it was something even more miraculous: an immediate 14-day ceasefire in Gaza and the West Bank, humanitarian corridors supervised by African Union peacekeepers, and prisoner exchanges overseen by neutral African mediators. Russia and China guaranteed the international framework, but the heart of the agreement carried an African seal. As the ink dried, the hall erupted in applause, not from politicians, but from the ordinary staffers, journalists, and observers who had doubted they would ever see such a moment. For the first time in over a decade, Israeli and Palestinian leaders had agreed to stop the bloodshed. The reactions outside were seismic. Crowds in Ramallah waved African Union flags alongside Palestinian banners. In Tel Aviv, even hardened skeptics admitted that perhaps, just perhaps, a window of hope had opened. Across Africa, television screens showed the image of Ibrahim Traoré between Abbas and Netanyahu, his uniform blending humility with authority. Young people chanted, "Africa, the Peacemaker," but not everyone celebrated. Within days, reports surfaced of mounting unease in Washington, Paris, and London. Western powers who had long monopolized Middle East diplomacy suddenly found themselves sidelined. Commentators warned that if the ceasefire held, it would mark a dramatic shift in global influence from the traditional powers to a continent once dismissed as a bystander. And so what began as a daring announcement in Ouagadougou had reached its climax in Amman, a ceasefire born not of power or wealth, but of empathy and courage. Ibrahim Traoré had achieved the impossible. Yet, even as the world cheered, dark forces were already plotting how to undo Africa's miracle. The ink on the Amman Accords had barely dried when the counterattack began, not from rockets in Gaza, but from offices in Washington, Paris, and London. Leaked intelligence reports later revealed that Western agencies had launched a covert effort codenamed Operation Desert Storm de Secque, with one objective: sabotage the African-led peace. Budgets worth millions were poured into disinformation campaigns painting Traore as an Iranian proxy. French media outlets in Francophone Africa suddenly questioned whether Burkina Faso had overstepped. British intelligence lobbied the European Union to reject illegitimate military leadership in diplomacy. Even Jordan, the host of the talks, was pressured with threats of economic retaliation if it continued to back the process. But the most brutal blow came on June 25, 2025. In Tel Aviv, as Traore's convoy made its way through the city, sniper fire rang out, glass shattered, screams erupted. When the dust settled, Lieutenant Kabore Traore's most trusted aide lay dead, and the president himself was wounded in the shoulder. Forensic analysis later traced the rifles to Western military suppliers, their precision consistent with special forces training. The attack was not random. It was meant to end the peace and, with it, Africa's rising voice. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Blood on the streets of Tel Aviv turned into a banner of solidarity. At a press conference with his arm bandaged, Traore stood firm. "They killed my friend to stop peace. His blood will not be wasted. The ceasefire will hold." His defiance electrified the world. Israeli and Palestinian delegates who had once eyed each other with suspicion jointly condemned the attack. The African Union convened an emergency session pledging full security for the continuation of talks. Russia and China doubled their protective presence. On July 15, 2025, Ibrahim Traoré returned to Ouagadougou. What awaited him was not a quiet homecoming, but a continental triumph. Over 2.3 million people flooded the streets waving flags of Burkina Faso alongside Palestinian and Israeli banners. Delegations from 34 African nations stood shoulder to shoulder, saluting a leader who had turned Africa into a peacemaker. Youth chanted in dozens of languages, "Africa brings peace. Africa brings hope." The political consequences were immediate. Across Africa, leaders who once played the role of followers now spoke of African solutions to global problems. South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa declared, "We are no longer beggars for Western answers. We are providers of wisdom." Kenya's Uhuru Kenyatta added, "This young man has proven that Africa deserves its seat at the global table." But beyond speeches, the human impact spoke louder. For the first time in over a decade, Gaza recorded 0 civilian casualties over a 4-month period. Humanitarian corridors supervised by African peacekeepers allowed medicine, food, and clean water to flow without obstruction. In Israel, families in border towns experienced silence, not the silence of mourning, but the rare silence of peace. Children in Gaza began returning to rebuilt classrooms, some staffed with African engineers and volunteers. The assassination attempt meant to silence Traoré had instead carved his name deeper into history. The tragedy of Lieutenant Kabore's death became a symbol, reminding the world that peace is never given freely, it is bought with sacrifice. And in that sacrifice, the ceasefire gained a legitimacy no Western treaty could match. Africa's voice had been tested by blood, and it had emerged unbroken. For decades, the United States positioned itself as the indispensable power in the Middle East. Presidents flew to Tel Aviv, envoys camped in Ramallah, and secretaries of state boasted of endless roadmaps to peace. Yet, in 2025, the longest ceasefire in over a decade was not signed in Washington, but in Amman, and it bore the fingerprints of Africa, not America. In the halls of the State Department, Traoré's success landed like a thunderclap. Analysts scrambled to explain how a 37-year-old African soldier had achieved what American presidents backed by trillions in aid and decades of influence could not. Congressional hearings asked blunt questions. Have we underestimated Africa? Have we lost the narrative of peace? For a nation accustomed to writing the script, being forced to watch from the sidelines was a humiliation. France, too, felt the sting. Long portraying itself as Africa's political tutor, Paris suddenly watched as Ouagadougou, not Paris, dictated terms of international diplomacy. French newspapers fumed, describing Traoré as a dangerous populist, while quietly increasing funding for Africa-focused media campaigns designed to dilute his influence. Britain followed a similar path, framing Traoré's success as a symbolic gesture rather than a substantive breakthrough. Yet the facts on the ground: 4 months of peace, 0 civilian casualties, spoke louder than their commentary. On the other side of the global stage, Moscow and Beijing embraced the new reality. Russia moved quickly to provide security for African mediators, framing it as a counterbalance to Western interference. China announced funding for an African peace infrastructure initiative, promising to build training centers for African diplomats and mediators. Even Iran and Turkey issued statements recognizing Africa's moral authority in mediation. For the first time in modern history, Africa was not simply receiving peacekeepers, it was sending them. The United Nations, often sidelined in past Middle East negotiations, openly praised the Amman Accords. Secretary General Antonio Guterres declared, "Africa has offered the world an example of diplomacy rooted in shared humanity." From Rome, the Vatican extended a rare invitation to Traoré for a private audience with Pope Francis, signaling moral endorsement from one of the world's oldest institutions. But perhaps the most profound reactions came from ordinary people, not governments. In diaspora communities across the United States, African Americans watched the news of Traoré's triumph with tears and pride. Commentators on U.S. talk shows asked aloud, how is it that a man from Burkina Faso can achieve peace when the so-called great powers only deliver war? Among older Americans, especially those who remembered the broken promises of Vietnam and Iraq, there was a recognition: perhaps peace requires empathy, not firepower. The implications stretched far beyond the Middle East. Ukraine quietly reached out, asking whether African mediation could soften its war with Russia. In East Africa, Ethiopia and Eritrea hinted at interest in Burkina Bay intervention along their tense border. Even Sudan and Chad signaled support for African Union-led conflict resolution mechanisms. For the United States, the question was no longer whether Africa had influence, but how long Washington could pretend otherwise. As one American commentator wrote in Foreign Policy, the 21st century will not only be shaped by Washington and Beijing, it will be shaped by Ouagadougou too. 4 months of silence in Gaza. 4 months without funerals in Israeli border towns. 4 months where aid trucks, not tanks, crossed checkpoints. This fragile peace, born not in Washington or Brussels, but in Amman under the guidance of an African leader, stands as proof that the impossible is possible. Yet history warns us, every fragile peace has enemies. Every step toward justice is met with resistance. The assassination attempt on June 25th was not just an attack on Ibrahim Traoré, it was an attack on the idea that Africa could lead. Those bullets were aimed at the hope that moral authority could outweigh military power, that empathy could break cycles of hatred. If the world forgets this lesson, if the ceasefire collapses, then those who profit from endless war will once again win. But imagine the alternative. Imagine an Africa that does not wait for handouts but exports peacekeepers, negotiators, and wisdom. Imagine a continent scarred by slavery and colonization, now healing wounds in the Middle East, in Ukraine, even in America's fractured politics. What if Africa's pain has become its greatest strength, the ability to understand suffering and to transform it into reconciliation? Brothers and sisters, this is the true meaning of Ibrahim Traoré's mission. It is not only about Palestine and Israel. It is about the rebirth of Africa's role in global history. It is about showing the elderly farmer in Burkina Faso, the student in Nairobi, the worker in Detroit, and the grandmother in Mississippi that peace is not the privilege of empires. Peace is the power of the people. The question now belongs to you. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies, both at home and abroad, are truly effective? Can the world continue to trust him to carry the burden of peace, or must Africa prepare to raise another generation of leaders to succeed him? If you believe that Africa deserves recognition as a peacemaker, please share this story. If you feel that you are among the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré, let your voice be heard in the comments. And if you believe like us that the truth matters more than the headlines, subscribe now and join us on this journey. Because the Middle East is watching, Africa is rising, and the world will never be the same.